Hello everyone, and wishing you a wonderful day. Today we are diving into a moment that will send a chill right through you, Mr. Tuan always smiles. But when that smile finally fades, and he leans across the table and whispers, "You think your mother's shares are safe?" What exactly has he been hiding all along? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The morning began the way Tu Tieu liked mornings to begin, quietly. The tea house was still cool from the night before, the wooden floors holding a faint chill that would be gone by mid-morning once the sun climbed higher over the hills. She had opened the shutters early, before Yuri was fully awake, and stood for a moment watching the mist curl through the tea fields below. There was something about that fog that always settled her. It didn't rush. It simply moved at its own pace, unhurried, taking up exactly the space it needed. She heard Yuri come down the stairs. His footsteps were even, careful, the way they always were when he was thinking too hard and trying not to show it. She had learned to read his footsteps the way she read the weather, little signs that told her the truth before any words did. She had already set 2 cups on the table. Steam rose in thin, curling lines. There was bread, a small dish of preserved plum, a bowl of rice congee she had kept warm under a folded cloth. Nothing complicated, just the things she knew he liked in the morning, the small nourishments that said, "I was thinking of you," before you even came downstairs. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the fog beyond the window. He was freshly dressed, the kind of careful that meant he had a meeting. Tu Tieu noticed the small furrow between his brows, the one that appeared when something was pressing on him that he hadn't decided how to speak about yet. She gave him the silence. She poured her own tea and sat across from him and let the morning do its work. After a while, he spoke. "Mr. Tuan asked to meet me," he said, alone. Tu Tieu's hand stayed still around her cup. She didn't panic. She didn't rush to fill the air with questions. She simply looked at him steady, clear the way she always did when the world tried to make things feel larger and more frightening than they needed to be in this particular moment. "Alone," she repeated. Yuri nodded. He said it was about the company's direction. A private conversation. Tu Tieu thought about that for a moment. She looked down at the steam rising from her cup, then back up at Yuri. "If he wants you alone," she said quietly, "it's because he wants you uncertain. He doesn't want anyone nearby who might help you think clearly." Something in his expression softened, not because her words took the weight away, but because they named it. There was relief in being understood. "Promise me one thing," Tu Tieu said. Her voice was gentle, but there was no bend in it. "No signing, no private commitments. Whatever he places on the table, you look at it, but your hands stay still." "I promise," he said. And because he was Yuri, that was enough. She believed him. He finished the last of his congee slowly. Tu Tieu refilled his cup without being asked. For a few minutes, they simply sat together in the warmth of the morning, not speaking. The only sounds, the distant call of birds and the soft knock of wind against the wooden shutters. This was something they had built together, without planning it, the ability to be quiet in the same space and have it feel like enough. When Yuri finally stood to leave, he paused at the doorway and looked back at her. His expression was the one she loved most on him. Steady, honest, without performance. Tu Tieu nodded. "I'll be here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." The cafe where Mr. Tuan had chosen to meet was the kind of place that felt expensive without announcing it. Everything was dark wood and soft lighting, and the kind of quiet that had been carefully designed rather than simply left to itself. It smelled of strong coffee and something faintly floral, like someone had placed a bouquet nearby and then removed it, leaving only the memory. Mr. Tuan was already seated when Yuri arrived. He stood to greet him, hand extended, smile wide and practiced. "Yuri," he said warmly, "it's good of you to come. Please, sit." I already ordered, I hope you don't mind." He gestured to the table, as though he were welcoming a guest into his own home. There was tea, a small plate of pastries, everything arranged with the comfortable ease of a man who was used to setting tables on his own terms. Yuri sat. He kept his posture open and relaxed. He had learned long ago that stillness could be its own kind of strength. Mr. Tuan talked the way he always did, smoothly, warmly, with the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed without making it obvious. He asked about the project in the Northern District, praised a report Yuri had submitted the previous month, called it thorough and mature. He used the word loyalty twice in the first few minutes, both times as though it were a compliment. "You have a real future here," Mr. Tuan said. He leaned back in his chair, easy and expansive. "Your work ethic, your attention to detail, your steadiness under pressure, these are rare things, especially in someone your age." Yuri nodded. He said thank you in a way that was genuine, and also gave nothing away. On the table between them sat a neat folder. Pale blue cover, no label. Mr. Tuan had set it there when they sat down and had not yet opened it. It rested like a patient object, waiting for its moment. "How is your mother?" Mr. Tuan asked, and the warmth in his voice shifted by just a fraction, not enough for most people to notice. "She has been through so much. The situation at the company, the pressures. She is a strong woman, of course, but strength has its limits, especially at a certain age. Perhaps too hard. There comes a time when stepping back is not weakness, it's wisdom." Uri listened. He did not agree. He did not disagree. He simply received the words and let them settle, making note of each one. Tuan leaned forward slightly and folded his hands on the table. His voice shifted again, still warm, but with a new undertone, like sunlight moving behind a cloud without disappearing entirely. "I want to offer you something," he said, "not a bribe. Please don't misunderstand me. I want to offer you stability, a clear path forward, a promotion that reflects your actual value to this company." He paused. "There are certain procedures moving through the board at the moment, administrative things, necessary adjustments. Given everything that has happened, I only ask that you allow them to proceed without friction. Support Lynn's temporary measures, stay neutral in the votes, and if you can gently encourage your mother to take some time away. Rest. She deserves that." He smiled again, warm and reasonable. "This isn't betrayal," he said pleasantly. "This is survival. For you. For her. For everyone who depends on this company staying stable." Yuri was quiet for a moment. He looked at the folder on the table. Then he looked back at Mr. Tuan. "I appreciate your confidence in me," he said calmly. "I mean that sincerely, but I won't move against my mother's interests. Not through silence, not through votes, and not through persuading her to step back from what she built." His voice stayed level, respectful, without a single jagged edge. "I'm willing to follow any process that is transparent and documented. But private arrangements, I can't be part of those." Mr. Tuan's smile didn't disappear. That was the unsettling thing. It simply became a different kind of smile, thinner, more patient, the expression of a man who had heard this answer before and had already prepared for it. "Think of your girlfriend," he said softly, almost tenderly. "The one in the countryside, the tea house." He let the words sit in the air for a moment. Life can become complicated for the people around us, even when they have nothing to do with business. His jaw was set, but his voice when it came was quiet and clear. "I don't trade my family for comfort," he said. "That includes Tu Tieu." Mr. Tuan tilted his head. The smile held. "Of course not," he said pleasantly, as though Uri had said something charming rather than something that had drawn a firm and final line. "I understand completely." He reached down and tapped the closed folder once with 2 fingers. A light sound, almost gentle, but it landed in the silence like a warning. A few streets away, in the quieter part of the city where Mrs. Lan kept her house, Lynn sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she had poured herself without being asked. She did that often, moved through the house as though it were already hers, touching things gently, rearranging them slightly, always with a smile. Mrs. Lan sat across from her, folding a piece of cloth over and over, without much purpose, her hands needing something to do. Tu Tieu came to visit again? Lynn asked, her voice soft and light, the kind of voice that wrapped questions in warmth. Lan's hands slowed. She stopped by for a short time. Of course, Lynn smiled. She loves you. I'm glad she came. A pause. Did she ask about anything in particular? The family documents, the drawer in the hallway? Mrs. Lan's eyes moved briefly toward the hallway and then back to her lap. She only wanted to see me, she said. Lynn nodded, still smiling. She reached across and patted Mrs. Lan's hand. I know, she misses you. It's natural. She let the silence rest for a moment, then added casually, Mr. Tuan mentioned he was meeting with Yuri today. I hope it goes smoothly. These things can be stressful. Mrs. Lan looked up. Her face held something unease, guilt, a question she hadn't yet figured out how to ask. Lynn met her gaze with perfect calm, and Mrs. Lan looked away first. Lynn lifted her cup and drank her tea, and said nothing more. But Mrs. Lan sat very still after that, her hands no longer folding the cloth, her eyes resting on the middle distance. The way her daughter had stood in this kitchen with careful eyes and careful words, not accusing, not demanding, only asking, only hoping. And Mrs. Lan had given her so little in return, had offered so little of the truth she was sitting on, heavy and uncomfortable as a stone. She thought about the drawer in the hallway. She thought about what was inside it, and for the first time in a long while, she felt not just guilt, but something sharper beneath it, the first small edge of courage. Still fragile, not yet ready to cut through anything, but there, present, waiting. Back in the tea house, Tu Tieu had settled at the small table near the window where the light was best in the afternoon. She had a piece of paper in front of her, and she was writing not quickly, but with the deliberate care of someone who understood that the right words, put in the right order, could protect people as surely as anything else. She wrote a short list. She kept it simple. 4 things. Don't sign anything. Ask for originals. Request email records. Keep every meeting documented. She looked at the list. Then she took out her phone and typed a message to Uri. She didn't write anything dramatic. She didn't warn him or worry aloud onto the screen. She simply wrote, I trust your calm. I trust your heart. She set the phone down and looked out through the window at the fog moving slowly across the lower fields. She breathed in the smell of tea leaves and damp earth and something faintly sweet from the flowers her neighbor kept along the fence. This was the thing Tu Tieu had learned about patience. It was not the same as waiting. Waiting was passive. Patience was a choice you made actively, again and again, in every moment that wanted you to panic. She chose it now. She trusted Yuri to be who he was. By the time Yuri arrived at Mrs. Ngier's that evening, the light had turned to the deep amber of late afternoon, and the house smelled of the simple dinner his mother had prepared, something warm and nourishing, the kind of meal that said you are home and you are safe. Mrs. Ngier listened to everything Yuri told her without interrupting. She sat very straight, the way she always did, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes focused and clear. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He will not stop, she said. Her voice was calm, not frightened. He never stopped. He simply waited until the timing suited him. She looked at Yuri with the kind of gaze that had seen too much to be surprised by any of it, but had chosen not to become hardened. "A smiling man can still hold a knife on paper," she said quietly. "That is what makes him more dangerous than someone who shouts." "He called you old-fashioned," Uri said. Mrs. Ngia made a soft sound, not quite a laugh. "That is what people say when they cannot argue with the truth." She looked at her son. "Collect proof. Everything in writing. Emails, dates, names. Do not let your anger be visible. Not because anger is wrong, but because men like Mr. Tuan use your emotions against you. And protect Tu Tieu." Her voice became a little softer there. "Keep her out of the direct fire. She has already given so much." Uri nodded. He thought of Tu Tieu sitting in the tea house, writing her small, careful list, sending him that short message full of quiet faith. "I trust your calm." He thought of how she had not asked him to be fearless. She had only asked him to stay steady. That was something he could do. She held it there for a moment, just a moment, and in that small gesture was everything a mother could say without words. That she was proud of him, that she was frightened but would not let it rule her, that she trusted him to carry this carefully and not be broken by it. Then she released his arm, straightened her back, and said briskly, "Now eat something. You've been running all day and thinking too hard on an empty stomach." Yuri smiled, the first real smile he had allowed himself since morning. He sat down and let his mother feed him. And for a little while, the evening felt almost ordinary. What Mr. Tuan had said in the cafe, the full weight of it came back to Uri piece by piece later that night. As he stood outside in the cooling air, the city lights scattered yellow and white below him. He replayed the conversation the way you replay something when you realize, only afterward, that the most important moment came disguised as a small remark. Mr. Tuan had opened the folder near the end of the meeting. The pages inside were neat and official-looking columns of numbers, procedural notations, dates. And near the bottom of the second page, a date that Yuri recognized immediately. The date his mother had spent in the hospital, a quiet, frightening week that the family did not speak of often. "These procedures move quickly, Mr. Tuan had said pleasantly, tracing one finger along the column. "Especially when certain shareholders are unavailable to weigh in. Proxies can be assigned, of course, but proxy decisions, once made, those can be difficult to unravel," he said. "Not threats, simply the reality of how things move." And then, at the very end, as they stood to leave and shook hands with that practiced warmth, Mr. Tuan had tilted his head slightly and said, very quietly, "You think your mother's shares are safe?" The smile had remained. The eyes had not changed. Yuri had nodded politely, thanked him for his time, and walked out into the daylight with his breathing steady and his mind already working. Now, standing in the cool night air, he understood what had been said beneath the words, the shares, the hospital date, a proxy signature that perhaps had never truly been his mother's choice. Documents that moved while she lay quietly in a hospital bed, believing herself to be resting safely, not knowing that her name was being used in rooms she could not see. He took out his phone. He called Tu Tieu. She answered on the second ring, her voice soft and immediate, as though some part of her had been waiting for exactly this. "How are you?" she asked. "I'm all right," he said, and then, steadily, without alarm, without dramatics. "Because I think the danger is larger than we understood." He could picture her clearly, the tea house lamp glowing warm behind her, her small, careful list still on the table, her face calm and present and completely reliably there. She said simply, "Tell me everything." Yuri looked up at the city lights and breathed in the night air. And he began to speak. Yuri begins his morning at Tu Tieu's tea house, where she quietly reminds him to sign nothing and trust no one's smile. Tuan at a private cafe, a man who speaks warmly, compliments generously, and hides every threat inside a polite sentence. Tuan offers Uri a promotion, stability, and protection in exchange for his silence, his loyalty to Lin's procedures, and his mother's slow removal from power. Uri refuses, calmly and completely. Meanwhile, Lin tightens her grip at Mrs. Lan's home, asking careful questions while Mrs. Lan sits with guilt growing quietly in her chest. Tu Tieu waits at the tea house, writing a small list of rules to protect the people she loves. And Mrs. Gia warns her son with words that land like quiet thunder. A smiling man can still hold a knife on paper. Then comes the line that changes everything.